October 27, 1962, two influential men, Robert F. Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrynin, Soviet ambassador, reached a consensus on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nevertheless, the question arose, what was the most efficient and safe way to reach Moscow? Since Washington and the Kremlin had no direct phone connection, any communication would normally be conducted through an operator, and then a second operator, any of whom could listen to what was said. The telegraph appeared to be the only solution. The Soviet ambassador then inscribed his account of the meeting and sent it by Western Union. A young lad came by on bicycle from the Western Union to pick up the message. Dobrynin nervously watched him pedal off, hoping that this boy would neither stop for a Coca-Cola or dally with his girlfriend along the way. In other words, the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and more broadly, the fate of humanity, rested on this boy's shoulders.
Following the Bay of Pigs invasion fiasco, a failed attempt by the CIA in 1961 to remove Cuba's communist dictator Fidel Castro from power, Fidel Castro and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to install nuclear missiles in Cuba to both deter any future invasion attempts by the U.S. and to counteract the presence of U.S. nuclear missile installations in Italy and Turkey. This was called Operation Anidar. The CIA was tipped off to by Soviet spy Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, who assisted with war plans, secret documents, and other intelligence to the agency. On October 14th, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba confirmed the presence of Soviet missiles. As a result, for an intense 13 days, October 16th through the 28th, the U.S. and the Soviet Union came toe-to-toe with each other in a confrontation that would be the nearest the world ever came to nuclear annihilation during the Cold War.
About it, I remember one of my classmates, I remember his name, his first name was Martin. He said, it looks like war. He was 11-year-old. It's kind of made an impression on me, and it was clearly making an impression on people I went to school with, my fellow 11-year-olds in the 6th grade, because that's not something you normally talk about in terms of current events that much, particularly when you're 11 years old. Those days I was more into baseball. In fact, I think the Yankees were in the World Series that year.
On October 16, 1962, President Kennedy, along with his administration and national defense officials, were briefed on the U-2 findings. There were many discussions on ways to respond to the Soviets. Two principal courses of military action were discussed, either an airstrike accompanied by an invasion or a naval quarantine with a threat of further military escalation. To avoid public panic, the president maintained his official public schedule while privately meeting with advisors to discuss the status of developing events in Cuba and possible strategies.
At the time, the U.S. had almost double the nuclear arsenal that the Soviet Union did. In Cuba, the Soviets had the SS-6 Sapwood, SS-7 Sattler, SS-6 Skene, and the SS-4 Sandal. The following day, military units began flowing into bases in the southeast as U-2 reconnaissance flights showed a continual construction of missile sites in Cuba, complete with intermediate-range missiles capable of striking most of the continental United States. Kennedy's crisis team was divided between the Hawks, who proposed an invasion as soon as possible, and the Doves, who preferred peaceful foreign policy negotiations.
I was in high school during that period of time, and my parents were a bit concerned, but not totally, because they had faith in the government that reason was going to rule the day, and that we would not go into a military conflict with the Soviet Union.
Time, however, was on the Hawk side, because the more the U.S. delayed any military action, missile installations were getting ever closer to completion. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy proposed a swift and surgical airstrike that took the missiles out with limited casualties. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Youth nevertheless couldn't guarantee a total destruction of Russia's missiles in Cuba.
On October 18th, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko met with the president, ensuring the weapons were defensive. Kennedy knew otherwise but didn't press the issue. He gave the Gromyko a warning that gravest consequences would ensue in the event offensive nuclear weapons were in Cuba. 2 days later, President Kennedy decided on a quarantine of Cuba. He would direct naval warships to encircle Cuba to block additional missiles from entering. Nikita Khrushchev declared Kennedy's action as an act of war.
October 22nd, 1962, Kennedy established the Executive Committee of the National Security Council and instructed it to meet daily during the crisis. Kennedy also wrote to Nikita Khrushchev stating the following: I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would, in this nuclear age, deliberately plunge the world into a war in which it was crystal clear no country could win, and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor. At 7 p.m., Kennedy addressed the nation on television, revealing the evidence of Soviet missiles in Cuba, and called for their removal.
My fellow citizens, Let no one doubt that this is a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set out. No one can foresee precisely what course it will take, or what costs or casualties will be incurred. Many months of sacrifice and self-discipline lie ahead, months in which both our patience and our will be tested, months in which many threats and denunciations will keep us aware of our dangers. But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing.
He announced the establishment of a naval quarantine around Cuba until the Soviets agreed to dismantle the missile sites. And to make certain that no additional missiles were shipped to Cuba, President Kennedy demanded that Khrushchev halt any Russian ships heading toward Cuba. Khrushchev the next day announced the quarantine. You, Mr. President, are not declaring quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force. Consider what you are saying. And you want to persuade me to agree to this? What would it mean to agree to these demands? It would mean guiding oneself in one's relations with other countries, not by reason, but by submitting to arbitrariness. We are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us.
People was protesting. Everyone was scared because they thought Third World War was going to begin.
The U.S. military moved to DEFCON 2 on the 24th. Once the blockade was in place, all Soviet ships bound for Cuba either held their positions or reversed course. Nevertheless, the missiles in Cuba became operational on Cuban airfields for the arrival of the Soviet Il-28 bombers. Fearing an attack from the U.S., Castro suggested to Khrushchev that the USSR should attack first. A Soviet spy, Alexander Fomin, approached ABC News' John Scali to offer a diplomatic solution: the removal of the missiles in exchange for a promise not to invade Cuba. The Soviet premier sent a letter with a similar message to President Kennedy, stating his willingness to remove the missiles from the island if the United States pledged to never invade Cuba.
On the 25th, the U.S. requested an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, where the Soviet ambassador denied the presence of missiles in Cuba. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson told the Soviet ambassador he was willing to wait until hell freezes over for an answer from the USSR. Then he showed the reconnaissance photos to the UN. On October 27th, an American U-2 plane following reconnaissance over Cuba was shot down by a Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile, and the pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed. Soon after, a Soviet nuclear-armed submarine was hit by a small depth charge positioned in the Caribbean by an American Navy vessel. Thus, commanders on the sub believed that war had begun, and they prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. Such a drastic decision had to be unanimously agreed upon by 3 naval Soviet officers. The captain and a political officer both favored to launch, but Vasily Arkhipov, second in command, refused. Later that night, Robert Kennedy met secretly with Dobrynin and reached a basic understanding. The Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba under United Nations supervision in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. Also, it was confidentially understood that the United States would eventually remove the missiles from Turkey and Italy. This agreement had to be communicated. The bicycle boy mentioned at the beginning, and whose name no one had bothered to document, saved the world from nuclear war by taking the telegraph to Western Union and delivering the document without trouble. The next day, the Soviets agreed to publicly remove the missiles in exchange for a promise not to invade Cuba. No mention was made in regards to the secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey and Italy. The missiles in Cuba were loaded and shipped back to the Soviet Union in early November 1962, and the nuclear missiles were removed from Turkey by the end of April 1963.
This compromise has proven to be one of the most significant agreements in history, thwarting worldwide devastations. Patience, compromise, and masterly handled diplomacy advanced unwarlike decisions, culminating in peace. The nonviolent path is often the preferred one, while understanding the opponent's side to reach them oftentimes ensures the best agreement. The English proverb, "You don't know where you're going until you know where you've been," is so appropriate for modern-day political leaders. Past precedent should be relied upon to assist us toward the solution of problems and for improvement of relations with other nations. It's been repeatedly stated, those who fail to learn from history are sure to repeat the mistakes of the past. Let's pray that the Cuban Missile Crisis will always serve to encourage us toward peaceful compromise without necessarily compromising our ideals of freedom and security.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom. Thank you and good night.